Welcome back to the France 24 News Desk. I'm Jeannie Godula in Paris. Let's take a look at today's headlines. The British Parliament is voting today on whether or not to delay the final Brexit date of March 29th. This as France gets a taste of post-Brexit chaos as a protest at the Gare du Nord train station in Paris blocks all trains to London. Algeria's new prime minister says the new government will be formed early next week, the latest reaction to mass street protests that pushed the long-serving president to renounce his bid for a fifth term in office. And the French president is in Kenya kicking off the One Planet Climate Summit today. This as a new UN report says 1 in 4 deaths and disease around the world is linked to global warming. Our Nairobi correspondent Julia Steers standing by with more. The British Parliament's gearing up for a third night of Brexit voting this week. This evening, MPs will decide whether or not to delay the official divorce date that's now just 15 days away. If that delay is approved, the 27 other EU nations would still also have to approve the delay. And speaking last night in Parliament, after MPs voted not to crash out without a deal, the Prime Minister said the postponement would mean nothing if there was still no agreement on a deal. Peter O'Brien explains.
They've voted against a no deal, but this doesn't mean they're safe from it. Next up in the obstacle course is a vote on delaying Brexit. If this fails, the UK could still leave the EU without a deal. If it succeeds, however, Theresa May will request an extension to the departure date. If EU members don't agree, the UK would be more likely than ever to be out without a deal. But if they do agree to a delay, a whole new box of possibilities would open up. No deal would remain the default outcome if no other solution is found. Theresa May might have another stab at getting her deal through Parliament, despite it being rejected twice already. The government could try to renegotiate an entirely new deal, though European leaders have said the one rejected on Tuesday was their final offer. There could be another referendum, either advisory like the one 3 years ago, or legally binding. There could be an early general election, either after the Prime Minister asks Parliament to vote for one, attempting to gain backing for her deal, or if Labour calls for a vote of no confidence and the government loses. Finally, the European Court of Justice has ruled that the UK could cancel Brexit unilaterally.
Ian Begg is a professor at the European Institute at the London School of Economics. He joins me now from London. Ian, thanks for taking the time to speak to us. What are your thoughts here on what went down last night and the vote we're looking forward to today?
It's a mess. It's a mess. It's a mess. That's my 3 thoughts on it. And the way things are going, I think it's highly likely that Parliament is going to vote this evening for asking for an extension. The big question then will be, what is the purpose of that extension and how long should it be? Many sane voices in this mess are saying that the extension should be for much longer than 3 months to enable much more time to be devoted to working out a future relationship. Bear in mind that the withdrawal deal that you mentioned in your package is one which has been negotiated by the EU on the basis of the red lines that Theresa May set, such as leaving the single market, leaving the customs union and so on. I think what the UK system now needs is more time to reflect on whether any or many of these red lines should now be abandoned, setting the tone for an entirely different negotiation.
Well, what would be the way to do that exactly? I mean, what would be the smartest thing to happen? Should some sort of new committee be formed? I mean, how would they get to that point?
Well, if you ask me, the ideal solution, it would be to get rid of Theresa May and get rid of Jeremy Corbyn and have a cross-party national government of more sensible people. However, that's not an easy thing to engineer in British politics. And what we should look for instead is more time for the British system collectively to think about the way to do this. And that would point to an extension more like 1 year than the 3 months that many are talking about.
And do you think that if that was voted on, let's just say hypothetically, and was approved, do you think that that is something that the EU, those 27 EU countries that would need to agree to that as well, would agree to give the UK this delay?
I think there's a willingness on the EU side to accord a delay to the UK, provided it is for something tangible. What the EU side does not want to do is to allow a delay which has simply been more procrastination, more kicking of the can down the road. And that's why I think that the reason for the delay would have to be made as clear as possible. It's to rethink the entire negotiating position of the UK.
What are your thoughts on the infamous people's referendum? Do you think that that's something that could still happen? Could there be some sort of new vote, perhaps, where the people could get their say and perhaps shut Brexit down altogether?
Well, it's one way in which the UK collectively can decide is by putting the vote back to the people instead of expecting Parliament to do it. However, before you can get to a new referendum, you need a majority of Parliament to approve an act of Parliament giving voice to the people again. We have no statutory provision for referenda in the UK system, and that means it needs an act of Parliament to be passed to enable it to happen. And just to put that in perspective, there have been estimates that how fast that could happen, and the most quick way of doing it would take at least 5 months.
Which, of course, then would leave the UK again in this tricky position of perhaps having to hold European elections for an EU it doesn't even want to be part of.
Well, let's see whether it does indeed want to be part of it, because that would be one of the questions to pose in a second referendum is, have you changed your mind? Which is perfectly possible. Organising the European elections is obviously a difficulty for both sides, because as things stand, the UK has decided to apportion the 73 seats currently held by the Brits. 48 will be suppressed, but a number will go to other countries, including 14 going to France, which will then start to be concerned, well, what happens to our 14 new seats? So there are all kinds of ramifications of this. But I think they're second order compared with the overall question of avoiding no deal and getting a sensible future relationship between the UK and the rest of the European Union. And that sensible relationship could potentially include no longer departing.
Ian, thank you for that. Ian Begg there speaking to us from London. Meanwhile, British prosecutors have charged a former British soldier with murder over the 1972 killings in Northern Ireland. That's linked to the deaths of 13 civil rights protesters in Northern Ireland more than 40 years ago in an event known as Bloody Sunday. The former paratrooper, who is known only as Soldier F, is being charged with 2 murders and 4 more attempted murders. He was one of 17 veterans who had been facing possible prosecution in the politically sensitive case. And Algeria's new prime minister has just given a press conference announcing the country's new government. Noureddine Bedoui says his new cabinet will be formed sometime early next week. That comes after weeks of mass protests that forced the president, Abdelaziz Bouteflika, the man who's run Algeria for 20 years, to renounce his bid for a 5th term. The prime minister said he would form an inclusive and technocratic government that would include young Algerians. And just remember, it was young people there who made up the bulk of the protesters in the first place. Here's more now from the newly appointed prime minister speaking today.
The president, Abdelaziz Bouteflika, reacted swiftly and with lots of understanding. The letter he addressed to the nation was a first step in order to turn the people's demands into concrete actions. That is why we must insist on working in an honest and serious manner. We must do it all together, hand in hand, no exceptions and no limits. We must talk among one another, all of us, with the children of our nation, Algeria.
Well, as the French president, Emmanuel Macron, is hosting a climate summit in the Kenyan capital, Nairobi, today, here in France, 4 major NGOs are suing the French state for inaction on climate change. This morning, the group filed a lawsuit marking the first step of court proceedings. This follows a petition that was signed by more than 2 million people. Now, that is a record here in France. Well, to talk a bit more about this with me now, I'm joined on the set by Marine Denis, the legal advocate for Notre Affaire à Tous, one of the 4 NGOs that's leading the charge. Marine, thanks so much for coming in to speak to us. Why exactly are you and these other organizations suing the government?
So actually, we've noticed that a lot of public policies have not been respecting or implemented in terms of the fight against climate change. So we are now trying to use the current text of the French law, international public law, and European law to see if we could force the French state and the French administration to go further in terms of the fight against climate change.
So what proof is there exactly that the French state's actions are illegal?
So if we look at the objectives the French state wanted to follow in terms of the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions, we can notice that this greenhouse gas emission increased in 2017, and the French state is forced to follow the European directive signed in 2009, and so it's not respecting its scientific objectives in terms of the reduction of GES.
So what can a court do? Can a court actually force the French government to act? Is there any precedent for this?
No, there's no precedent in the French law, so we are very inspired by other climate litigation cases, such as the one in the Netherlands, so the Urgenda case, and other existing cases in Pakistani or Colombia. So no, actually, that's a first thing. That's the first case law in France, but we are very hopeful, to be very honest. And even if we cannot force the French state to pay any environmental damage, we can maybe force him to adopt public policies more ambitious in terms of protection of climate and environment.
Now, you mentioned this similar case in the Netherlands, a case that took 6 years actually to be judged. Do you think that we're looking at a similar time frame here in France?
That's very difficult to estimate because so we will have several steps in the procedure, and as it's the first time, we'll probably lose in the upcoming month. We don't know so far, but we stay very hopeful, and we hope that even if we don't achieve our targets, our objective, maybe the administrative judge will keep some of the principles we have mentioned in our case law.
A UN report came out yesterday there in Kenya, where the French president is now. It claims that 1 in 4 premature deaths and diseases can be linked to pollution, to environmental degradation. Do you think the world has that time to wait for the outcome of these lengthy legal battles, if that's what this becomes as well?
I don't think we have time. That's what we are using the legal way to force the state to go further and to be more ambitious. I think we are now tackling the political willingness at the same time, because we are aware of many things in terms of policies and political discourse and speech, talking about the Make Our Planet Great Again thing, talking about the One Planet Summit, but we want concrete act. And when we look at the gap between objectives that are taken and the reality of the facts, we are not that happy, to be honest.
Maureen, thank you so much for coming to speak to us. Maureen Denny, the legal advocate for Notre Affaire à tous, which is one of the 4 major NGOs that's currently suing the French government. Thanks so much for coming in.
Thank you.
All right, in the meantime, let's go now to Kenya, where the French President Emmanuel Macron stood alongside Kenya's President Uhuru Kenyatta to launch that climate summit that is on in Nairobi today. It's called the One Planet Summit. It's backed by France and the UN and is hoping to push nations to dramatically cut consumption and waste. Well, that, of course, comes after that report I was just mentioning, saying 1 in 4 deaths or diseases are linked to global warming. Here's more of what President Macron had to say in Nairobi today, saying the time for talk is over.
From Uganda to the United States to nearly every country represented here, the youth are rallying. Every week they express their impatience, they express their dissatisfaction. They say that for too long and for the wrong reasons you haven't been and you don't want to change things. You're not acting fast enough. So our job is to act.
Well, to talk a bit more about President Macron's trip there to Kenya, let's bring in Julia Steers, who joins us live from Nairobi. Julia, tell us a bit more.
Culture. So we talk of partnership in terms of students.
Julia, if you can hear me, Julia Steers in Nairobi, tell us a bit more about President Macron's day there today in Kenya and this fight against climate change. All right, sorry about that. We do seem to be having some sort of technical difficulty with Julia. We'll try and get back to her if we can a little bit later today. In the meantime, let me tell you about that massive oil slick that's now heading toward France's southwestern coastline. That's after a fire broke out on an Italian cargo ship that caused it to sink in the Atlantic Ocean. Simon Harding has the details.
The Grande America, ablaze in the Atlantic Ocean off the French coast. The Italian cargo ship sank on Tuesday en route from Hamburg to Casablanca. Authorities fear a major pollution disaster. 330 kilometers off the coast of La Rochelle, the vessel was carrying thousands of second-hand vehicles. More worryingly, it also had over 2,000 tons of crude oil and 365 containers on board, 45 of which are deemed to be carrying toxic substances. The French Navy has identified a petrol spill heading towards the shore. They believe it is 12 kilometers long and 1 kilometer wide.
There are perhaps 100 tons of hydrochloric acid, I believe 70 tons of sulfuric acid, and a number of other substances. Daily flyovers by surveillance aircraft to the French Navy have already been put in place to locate any containers that have not sunk.
The government has also deployed a special anti-pollution vessel, the Argonaut, which is expected to be on site this Friday. The Ministry of Ecology has said the petrol spill should make landfall early next week. The owners of the Grande America, the Grimaldi Grouper, was handed a letter of formal notice which reminded it of its responsibilities to safeguard the environment in relation to marine pollution.
Well, a few minutes ago, you heard the French president talking about young people and how important they are in the fight against climate change. And a massive worldwide protest movement is being planned by teenagers for this Friday. Now, it began 6 months ago with just one teenager, a 15-year-old girl who was camped out in front of Sweden's parliament with a handwritten sign saying, "School strike for climate." Well, now that youth-led strike that's planned for Friday is promising 1,000 actions spread over 100 countries in a grassroots campaign that's hoping to goad world leaders into confronting the threat of global warming. It's a movement activists and experts are saying could be a milestone moment.